Hey, it's Ben from ZOAR Fitness, and on this Ask Ben episode, I'm going to be going over why should you breathe through your nose while working out. All right. So this question came from Lauren DeReamer. She said, "Hey Ben, I read your article on nasal breathing, but I find nasal breathing much more challenging than breathing through my nose, through my mouth. Is this normal? Are there certain workout scenarios or intensity thresholds that you recommend not nasal breathing? Thanks. I appreciate all the content you've been putting out with ZOAR." Well, thank you, Lauren. So let's get into it. Obviously, I love talking about breathing. I wrote a book on it, and also a few articles, and that's what she's kind of referencing here. So I'll link to them below. Go check them out if you haven't yet. There's definitely a lot of insights there that I won't be able to get into right here. All right. So that being said, let's get into it. All right. So I have 6 different talking points that I'm kind of want to cover here. And I think what she's alluding to, a lot of people have dealt with. So I kind of do want to address this for a bunch of different people because it's not something I've actually talked about before. So number 1, nose breathing through your nose, like nasal breathing, right, is more challenging than mouth breathing, period. Like, think about it this way, right? Think how big your mouth is. Think about how big your nostrils are, like really small. So essentially, it's like when you're nasal breathing, it's like trying to like drink a milkshake with like a coffee straw, like. You really have to like suck as hard as you can, and it takes like literally more like effort from your respiratory muscles, right? Like your diaphragm, your intercostals, like your scalenes, like all of it. Like it takes much more work to pull that air into your body through a very small portal versus a really big one, right? The advantage to pulling it in with that really small portal is that it's a filter, right? Your nose is a filter. There it is, right? So it's actually going to, again, pull out a lot of, again, just kind of the environmental toxins that are there. And the other thing it does is it moisturizes it as it pulls it in. And the other last thing is that it impacts your nervous system state. So it's keeping you more relaxed as you're actually doing that working out, right? Beyond that, there's a whole bunch of reasons why we're going to nasal breathe that have kind of implications because of those things. Right? So to say that, like, is this something that's like normal for like nasal breathing to be harder? Like, no, it's not normal. It is universal, right? So it's like the case for every single person. Like, it's more challenging to nasal breathe, right? Realize that if you're not really having as powerful of breaths, it's a more relaxed environment, just because it's maybe a longer duration workout, your work rate's not as high, maybe you're doing your rest periods, or you're just like lifestyle, like even sleeping, right? In all of those scenarios, like you're just not exchanging as much air, so you don't need to like, again, onboard, offboard as much air as quickly, right? So it just makes more sense for you to be able to breathe through your nose in those scenarios and take advantage of the benefits of nasal breathing. So think about it this way. If you make things more challenging on yourself in training, compete easy, train hard, right? So if you do things to make yourself, again, have a more challenging environment during your actual training, then when you go to compete or test or anything like that, it's going to be much easier. So how I'm relating this to nasal breathing is again, it's more challenging to breathe through your nose, but when you're able to breathe in your mouth in just like a normal unregulated environment, like you would in like a competition at a really high work rate, then it just makes sense for you to be able to breathe uninhibited through your mouth and be able to off and onboard a whole lot more exchange of gas, right? So next, we have to understand that if you're breathing deeply, which again, if you're a whole lot stronger respiratory muscles, you're going to be able to get deeper breaths in and work against the elasticity that's kind of natural to your respiratory muscles. So basically, think about it this way, right? If you completely relax like that, you find that like your breath kind of evens out in the middle, like not at the very high and like, see how like the air like rushed in or rushed out because I was at the extreme. Basically, because if I'm all the way inhaled, my expiratory muscles are in stretch. So when I release, it's going to bring me back down to kind of the set point, right? If I, same thing, exhale all the way, the inspiratory muscles are on stretch. And when I release, air rushes in, right? You're just trying to find that balance. And it's also about pressure from the environment versus what's in your lungs, right? You're just trying to make that even. So if you have stronger respiratory muscles, it's easier to work at whatever kind of, again, taking as much or as little air as you want and that way you don't have to rely on just trying to be at that set point most of the time. If you're stronger, you get options, right? And we want to breathe deeper because breathing deeper is more efficient. I'm going to explain how, right? If we breathe shallow versus deep, say we take in 2 liters of air versus 4 liters of air, so like relatively shallow, relatively deep. I would say that's pretty normal for a lot of people. Either way, realize that my mouth, my trachea, right, like my bronchi, like all those basically, like the tubes, like the piping, where gas isn't going to be exchanged there, right? So the only place that gas actually gets exchanged is way down in the bottom of my lungs where the alveoli are, right? That's the smallest unit of the lung. That's where the capillaries actually, basically think of it as like the air-blood barrier, right? Where like that's going to be where carbon dioxide and other waste can be like popping out of the blood, right? Oxygen is going to be going in, right? Like that exchange happens at the alveoli. It doesn't happen in the bronchi. It doesn't happen in the trachea. It doesn't happen in your mouth. It can't, right? So what that is, that's dead space. There's no exchange that can happen there. So what that means is either way, whether I take a really small breath or a really deep breath, either way, 250 milliliters, let's just say that's the number, right, gets caught in this dead space. So if that's the case, 250 milliliters during a shallow breath, that's 1/8 of that breath that gets caught in the dead space. Whereas if I take a really deep breath, now I've taken 4 liters, that means that only 1/16 of the air is getting caught in the dead space. Like, it's just simple math, right? So if we take that into a percentage of like what would your efficiency be, 1/8 would be 88% efficient, meaning that 88% of the air is actually getting to the point where it can be exchanged, right? Whereas if I take a deeper breath, 94% would be exchanged, right? And this is just if it's 2 versus 4 liters. Say if it's 1 liter versus 5 liters, then it becomes more and more extreme. So the deeper of a breath you can take to fight that respiratory elasticity, you're going to have a more efficient breath. That being said, that's one of the things we're developing while we're doing nasal breathing is just your capacity to handle deep breathing for longer periods of time, right? Because respiratory rate tends to be lower if you're doing nasal breathing, right? You just tend to be a little bit more relaxed. All right. I kind of covered your nose being a filter, but essentially think of it this way. Like your nose, again, it's kind of like a Brita filter. When you pour water into a Brita filter, it takes a longer time for it to kind of pour through because it's getting filtered, right? Whereas if you went out behind your house and drank from the creek and just stuck your face in it and just like sucked in as much as you wanted to, like you were doing if you were mouth breathing, yeah, you're not getting any filtered. Like you can take on a lot more, but it's also like potentially a lot more hazardous to you, right? So just understanding that, especially when you're in lifestyle. So when you're sleeping, when you're just walking around, when you're not in actually intense activity, you must be nasal breathing. If you're not, you're again just not using your filter all the time, right? So again, think about like how potentially hazardous that is, and you also tend to hyperventilate. You also tend to be more anxiety ridden during those times because again, if you're just like when you're mouth breathing, it's basically telling your body that I am in a fight or flight response, right? And that's perfectly fine if you are in maximal exercise, but if you're not in maximal exercise, then you should not be there, right? So again, one of the reasons why I have athletes nasal breathe, especially during lower intensity activity, is because it teaches them that that's the default pattern, right? Rather than mouth breathing all the time, and then now I'm mouth breathing at night, and I'm mouth breathing like throughout my day, right? Where that becomes a really chronic and like it's a big issue for people. You want to breathe through your nose, right? And then once you feel like you need to transition to mouth breathing, especially in competitive environments, do so, right? Trust your intuition at that point, but you can't trust your intuition until you've developed all the skills that you need. All right. So again, that kind of got into some of the nervous system response. So basically just think about that as sympathetic, like fight or flight, versus parasympathetic, rest or digest, right? So you nasal breathing, especially in less stressful environments, is going to promote that parasympathetic state along with relaxed gaze, again, sort of that conversational pace that we talk about during basic aerobic function sessions, right? So, and then the last kind of implication of this is CO2 tolerance, which is a term that people throw around sometimes, and I think most people don't understand what it means or understand why it has relevance. So CO2 tolerance is basically saying like your ability to deal with CO2 in your system, which again is a good thing because it prevents you from breathing too much, right? CO2 is basically the mechanism that like cues us to breathe. So a really good CO2 tolerance test is you're sitting here, watching this video, breathe out all the way, holding your breath, start a timer, see how long you can hold your breath on the exhale, right? People who are very CO2 sensitive are going to be like less than 10 seconds. People who are doing okay, like moderate, like 20. People can hold that for definitely over a minute once they've gotten to more advanced stages, all right? So understand that again, this is a spectrum that we're talking about. But again, why is this relevant? So that was the test, but why is that even relevant? So it comes down to the Bohr effect. The Bohr effect is to use oxygen and to basically get oxygen into your muscle, there has to be CO2 present for them essentially to switch places. So that's what happens. So if we have CO2 in the cell, that will essentially trigger oxygen, right, to come into the cell. So if we've hyperventilated because we're not tolerant to CO2 and we've expelled all the CO2 out, or if you're mouth breathing all the time and you're hyperventilating, right, it's the same thing that happens during the night if you're mouth breathing, right, then we have no CO2 in the cell, and then oxygen doesn't come into the cell. So we're not actually being able to use oxygen if we offboard the CO2 too quickly. So basically, what we have to be able to develop then is your ability to be able to handle some CO2 so that we can use oxygen more efficiently. If we can do that, combined with deeper breathing, combined with nasal breathing, we can do that for longer periods of time or deeper into workouts, you're more efficient. So essentially, that's what this is all about, right? The whole thing with breathing is efficiency, right? You're trying to get as efficient as you can. Right? So it's perfectly normal for nasal breathing not to be super efficient at the beginning, for it not to be comfortable, for it not to be easy, right? But again, that's all perfectly fine because we're training, right? We're training so that when you go to compete and that you are at high intensity thresholds, that you can mouth breathe and you can do so more effectively and have a higher performance on game day. Because at the end of the day, that's what it's all about. All right? So hopefully that answered your question. So again, yeah, thanks for watching. So I want to ask you, if you have any training related questions for me to answer, go to the form below, fill that out. It'll just be asking you a few basic questions, and yeah, I'd be happy to answer your training related questions. And then lastly, head over to ZOARfitness.com for fitness articles, movement breakdowns, and one-on-one coaching for the sport of fitness. We'll see you next time.